Okay, this is the last mini lecture of the mutualisms week. And we're going to talk a little bit about mutualistic networks. And so there's a whole course on this that you can take with Dr. Fahimipour. It's really solid, math heavy, but you will leave being an expert in network ecology. But I feel like we can't talk about mutualisms without talking about networks. And I'm sure we're going to talk about networks a little later, but I wanted to talk specifically about mutualistic networks in this chapter. So we've been talking largely about pairwise interactions, yuccas and yucca moths, plants and their pollinators. And we've said that these pairwise interactions are diffuse, meaning that especially in facultative mutualisms, a given species can interact with a party of other interactors, right? So a given plant may be pollinated by lots and lots of different bees, and a given species of bee may visit lots and lots of different flowers. And one of the things that we can do to formalize that verbal description is build what we call a network. And you can sort of visualize networks in a bunch of different ways. So you can visualize a network as a series of nodes and edges, right? And in ecological network, the nodes, the points here, represent species, and the edges represent interactions between them, right? So here we might have one plant species that interacts with two different bugs, right? And this doesn't have to be a mutualistic network, right? This could be two different herbivores, for example. But we're talking about mutualistic networks right now. But this is one way to visualize these networks. It's the most common way that I think of people think of them. So if you think of a social network, you and all your friends are nodes, and the time that you spend together are the edges. Nodes are points, the connections are edges. The other way to visualize this, and the reason I'm sort of spending time on it, is we can visualize them as matrices. Matrices, the plural of matrix is matrices. Where it's a bunch of cells in a table, right? So here's a table with a bunch of columns and a bunch of rows. And in this matrix, let's imagine that each of the columns is a pollinator species, and each of the rows is a plant species. And you can imagine then we could fill in the cells for if these two species interacted, there's a square there. So this species of plant interacts with this species of pollinator. This species of plant here interacts with this species of pollinator, right? So these are another way to visualize networks, right? Another way to visualize networks where we, instead of having nodes and edges, we have a matrix where we fill in interactions. And those interactions can either be, binary, so like this species 0 or 1, yes it interacts or no it doesn't, or they could be numbers. We saw them interact 75 times. We saw them interact 10 times. Either way, they're both networks. One is called weighted, one is called unweighted, but you don't need to know that. And the reason I want to talk about networks now with mutualisms is that this network theory has really taken off in ecology in the last 20 years. It's really been a big part of the ecological renaissance in the last 20 years. And one of the parties, groups responsible for that are a couple of scientists, Pedro Giordano and Jordi Bascomte, who have been thinking a lot about mutualistic networks. So let me show you a paper I'm going to run you through here that's pretty foundational to understanding how understanding what we know about mutualisms. This is a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the PNAS, very prestigious journal, right? And this is Bascomte, Giordano. Jens Olesen is a good pollination biologist. I don't know Carlos Melian. I should probably know this person's name. I'll look them up after this. And the title of this article is The Nested Assembly of Plant-Animal Mutualistic Networks. And this is the key concept I want you to get here, which is the community concept, and why this follows that final lecture, which is that mutualistic networks are unusually nested. Unusually nested. What does that mean? I'm going to explain it. So this paper explains what this nestedness is and shows that it's a common phenomenon in mutualistic networks. So if we imagine a couple kinds of networks, right? In fact, I actually have the picture. We'll just look at it together. I was going to draw it, but you guys will benefit from seeing their beautiful picture. Let's assume a couple kinds of networks. This is figure 1 from this paper. And there's two hypothetical networks here. Panel A, let me get a color that's different enough for you to see. Panel A. Why is that so dark? Let's fix that, huh? Let's make it bright orange. Bright orange. Panel A and panel B. And you can see by looking at these that the network in A, again, we have plants and animals, and that's why I showed you this interaction up here. Each of these is little black squares represents an interaction. So animal species 1 interacts with plant species 10. Animal species 1 interacts with plant species 9. Animal species 1 interacts with plant species 8. And you can see these networks are very different. These are different kinds of ecological communities. In one of these networks, the most generalized animals interact with all of the plants, including the most generalist plants and the most specialist plants, right? So animal 1 is the most generalist. It interacts with 10 species of plants. And the plants that it interacts with are plant species 1, who is the most generalist, through plant species 10, who is the most specialist, right? Plant species 10 interacts with only one animal. Alternatively, the most specialist animals, the animals that only interact with one species, only interact with the most generalist animals. What's the alternate here? Let's imagine an alternate situation. I'm going to draw an alternate for you. Where the most specialist animal, 10, interacts with the most specialist plant, right? That's the alternate here. So we have all these other squares that make this nice triangle. But then we have this weird situation where the most specialist plant and the most specialist animal interact, right? This is called a nested network. This is a nested network. Next to it is a random network, probably, a less nested network. And so nestedness is the idea that in a network, specialists interact with generalists. And generalists interact with generalists and specialists. There's lots of ways to say this. This is my favorite way to say it. That specialists tend to interact with generalist partners. That plants that are pollinated by only one animal, that animal tends to visit a lot of plants. And animals that only go to one plant tend to go to a plant that has lots of other partners. And so these are two cartoons of networks, right? A is a perfectly nested network. B is a much less nested network. And then C is a real network, right, of 75 or 80 species of animal and 30 species of plant. And what you can see is that it's not perfectly nested. Perfectly nested would look like this, right? There'd be a perfect triangle. And there's a bunch of things that aren't perfect triangles, but it's pretty dang nested. Let's look back. Here's a line that shows the perfect nestedness in this case. And most of the connections in this network fall above that line, look more like panel A than panel B. And one of the really cool contributions of Bascomte and Giordano and a whole host of hundreds of other scientists who have been thinking about mutualistic networks, but these two folks have done a really good job pushing that field forward, is that mutualistic networks tend to be more nested. They tend to look more like A than they look like B. And I'm going to show you some evidence of that, right? So here's evidence of that. Let's look at the picture. This is the real key figure from this paper. There's a bunch of key figures, but my favorite one is here. Let's zoom in on this figure. So this is figure 2 from this paper. And they show you a bunch of different kinds of networks, right? And we can read the caption here and figure out what's going on. So in this figure, on the y-axis is nestedness. And a nestedness value of 1 means it looks like A. A nestedness value lower than that means it looks more like B. Okay, so these things look more like A, these things look more like B, right? And then they have a bunch of different kinds of points here. These points are different kinds of mutualisms, right? In this case, they're looking at seed dispersal mutualisms, which are circles. So these are animals. Your book talks a lot about this, so I hope you've read the chapter. Animals that consume fruits, and in doing so move seeds to new habitats. These are pollination mutualisms, so these are the ones that I study. And then these are food webs. These are trophic interactions. These are chapter 12 interactions. And what should be clear to you looking at this figure, I'll get rid of all my little orange arrows. What I hope is clear to you, based on panel A in this figure, is that the two mutualistic networks, seed dispersal and pollination, have much higher nestedness than food webs. Mutualistic networks look more like this than they do like this, which is quite cool. Why? And this is what's really fun about this. Why do we think mutualistic networks look more nested than food web networks? Well, this gets to the idea of the interdependence, that some mutualisms are obligate, that other mutualisms are facultative, but in the case of the partner not being there, your fitness is lower. So let's imagine a situation. I'm going to do some erasing here. Let's imagine a network here. Ooh, we're only erasing some of it. Let's zoom way in and we can draw down here. So let's imagine a network here. Here's our network. And our network is perfectly nested, right? Has that triangle. Let's imagine another network that's what we call modular. Modular networks look like this, where small groups of plants and animals interact together, where suites of specialist animals interact with suites of specialist plants, right? You guys see how that would work? So here we might have plant species 1 and 2, animal species 1 and 2, plant species 3 and 4, animal species 3 and 4, etc., etc. And you can see here why this is called modulars. These are little cliques. These are like you and the 3 or 4 friends you hang out with, and you never cross paths with other cliques at FAU, right? Species plant 1 and 2 interact with animal species 1 and 2. Species plant 3 and 4 interact with animal species 3 and 4. This is a highly modular network. This is very different than a highly nested network, right? This is our nested network on the other side. Let's imagine a situation now where we have an environment that is changing all the time. We have learned that abiotic environments are highly, highly variable across time. They're getting more stressful. And that variability leads to the extirpation of species and animal species 3. Animal species 3 is dead. What is going to happen to plant species 3 and 4? Right? Take a second to think about it. What's going to happen is their fitness is going to be lower, right? They only get visited by 2 species of animal, and one of them isn't there this year. Your reproduction as a plant is going to be extraordinarily low. Maybe if species 3 comes back next year, you can recover. But let's say that there's 2 bad years in a row. One bad year where species 3 is absent. One bad year where species 4 is absent. Now we're down to 1/4 of our population size, or 1/8 of our population size. Imagine that happens a couple times in a row. This whole module could go extinct, right? And it goes extinct because the animals rely on the plants, and the plants rely on the animals. So when one of those parties isn't there, their fitness is much lower. Would that happen in a nested network? The answer is, the theoretical answer, and what ecologists have come to find, is that it's less common for that extirpation to happen, right? If you're a specialist plant, you tend to interact with a generalist animal. Specialist plant tends to interact with a generalist animal. If you're a specialist animal, you tend to interact with a generalist plant. In years where you aren't there, your mutualist partner, the plant you eat, the bee you rely on for reproduction, gets supported by all the others, right? All the other parties it interacts with. And it turns out that this pattern of sort of like extinction of highly specialized modular interactions can lead to nestedness over time, right? Theoretically, we have models that show that. And that's one of the reasons we think that mutualism really shapes the structure of communities, right? That when we go out and look at how bees and flowers interact, it looks more like this because mutualisms rely on each party, and when one isn't there, you are also extirpated. The other is also extirpated. We end up with this nested structure. So this is a really cool way that sort of simple interactions can scale up to shape community patterns and diversity in an ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, check out this paper. It's actually a pretty, PNAS papers are great. If you want to read it, check out this DOI. I'll pause on it for a second. This is about the nested assembly of plant networks. So I appreciate all sticking around with me, dealing with my tech issues. If I could be writing on a blackboard, I would. I think you all would like it less, and 300 of you in a room would be a lot, but I'm figuring out how to make this work, and so I appreciate you giving me some grace here in the way that I try to give you guys grace on your assignments. So Yeah, have a great week. You guys are going to do awesome on your exams. I know it. You're doing wonderful. You're crushing it. Thank you. Bye.